Hey folks, Doug Blake with Body Design University. In this video, I want to talk to you about the basic concept of bioenergetics and do it in a way that will help you to understand the most basic components that go along with the study of bioenergetics itself. Now, just understand it is a vast field. There's a lot to it, but within the context of a personal trainers, it's really pretty straightforward with some basic concepts that are more than enough to help you to understand exactly how it can be used and dealt with respect to your clients and how they train and what they eat, things like that. So bioenergetics itself basically refers to cellular metabolism, the use, the creation, breakdown of ATP, ultimately energy in the cells, all the cells of the bodies. By the way, all the cells of every living system basically on the earth. First point here to remember is that when we talk about bioenergetics, the main concept, first and foremost, is ATP. So if there's anything that you get from this, is first and foremost is that if you're talking about the production of energy and we're talking about aerobic, anaerobic, and all these terms that we throw out at each other, bioenergetics ultimately relates to, from our perspective, the production of ATP. That's the very first thing you have to remember, adenosine triphosphate. Everything leads back to adenosine triphosphate. Everything you eat, every different substrate that eventually makes its way into the cells, into muscle cells, ultimately, in some cases, into the mitochondria, into the electron transport chain. Everything is about the production of ATP. I hope you get that. That's number one. Now, second is that there's two main ways. Okay, I'm trying to control, trying to explain it to any greater depth. But just remember, there's two main ways that ATP is produced from the food you eat, where your food's digested, and the substrates ultimately that create the molecules that will eventually be represented as ATP, right? So the two main ways, aerobically and anaerobically. See, I just threw terms out at you. I hope you understand what they mean. Aerobic with oxygen, anaerobic without oxygen. In the general explanation of bioenergetics, we normally start with the anaerobic side of the house, without oxygen. Why? Because the production of ATP, whether it comes from sugars or fats or proteins or alcohol, whatever it is your body is using and breaking down, the general rule is that anaerobic respiratory metabolism happens very quickly and produces the requisite number of ATPs right then and there. However, anaerobic respiratory metabolism, cellular level metabolism, does not produce a lot of it. It just does it really quick. So that's the second thing to remember, is that anaerobic and aerobic pathways to produce ATP have a cost-benefit ratio associated with them. The first one is that during anaerobic processes, right, and I'll explain the two of them, during anaerobic processes, you get ATP produced very quick, but you pay a price for it. You don't get much of it with the same amount of substrate, right? So if I talk about, like a gram of glucose, something like that. 1 gram of glucose through the anaerobic system produces this much ATP, but yet through the aerobic system, you get this much. Okay. So the point is second thing to keep in mind, aerobic and anaerobic. The anaerobic production of ATP through anaerobic pathways, this is the key concept. ATP is produced quickly, but you don't get a lot of it. I always look at it as you got to pay a price. If you're going to get the stuff fast, you're going to pay a price for it. You're not going to get as much. Why? Because we use the term inefficient when we're talking about the conversion of a substrate into ATP. So it's a very inefficient process. You pay for the quick production of ATP by not getting a lot of it. Okay, so that's like the second thing to keep in mind. Part of the second part of that is therefore the aerobic systems, right, of producing ATP take longer to get the ATP, but you get a lot more of it, a lot more ATP from a similar amount of substrate compared to anaerobic pathways. Get it? So number one, ATP, that's the end zone. Sort of pass, ATP, that's your end zone. You got to always remember that in bioenergetics. It's always about ATP. Okay. Second thing is that there's two main pathways to get ATP, right? You can have the running game or you can have the passing game, right? The running game takes a lot of time, right? I got to keep handing it off. I get 3 yards here. I get 5. If you don't know football, go Google it. I've got to run. It takes me a long time with the running game to get down to the end zone. Or I can be on the 20-yard line and take the snap and boop, just throw it 60 yards. Catch, touchdown. Get the idea? Um, so there's your analogy. I guess another analogy you can use is like don't take offense if I say, like a Toyota or a Prius or something like that, or like my car's a Hyundai, right? So really good, really great gas mileage, but they're not speedsters. You know what I'm saying? Versus a whatever, a Lexus or a sports car of some way, shape, or form. That's the analogy. What if I was to put a nitrous booster on one of those vehicles, right? And I hit the nitrous booster, bam, it will send, it gives a lot of power and energy to the vehicle, but very short period of time. So there's another analogy for you. It's the same thing with these energy systems, the anaerobic and aerobic. Anaerobic energy systems are designed to handle the super heavy, fast speed loads or fast power movement heavy loads that you're doing from a resistance training perspective, right? To get as fast as you can, get that ATP as fast as you can, but you're not going to get a lot of it. Okay, versus the long distance marathon runner, where as long as you're getting enough ATP to keep the muscles working, that's all right. But you'll get a lot of ATP. It just takes longer for the production of that ATP to occur, relatively longer. And so those are your analogies. So number one, ATP is the end zone. Anaerobic, aerobic, respiratory pathways. Is kind of the second thing to keep in mind when you're trying to understand and memorize this idea of what bioenergetics is all about. So if we start from the beginning with the anaerobic pathways, and we're talking about speed to production of ATP, that's how we do it. Just so you know, and you can write them down, you have the phosphagen system. It's sometimes termed the ATP-PC system. It's also known as the phosphagen system. That's the fastest, quickest way to get ATP, but you don't get a whole lot of it. And you essentially fatigue and burn out really quick, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, maybe 12. Who knows, 15 seconds. Is it really that relevant? No, unless you're at like the highest level of Olympic athletes and performance. But for the average person, it's irrelevant whether it's 7 seconds or 9 seconds. Really, it's not that important to understand it. But just so that you know that it is within this short time frame, even if it was 15 seconds, that's really short. 10 seconds, the average, depending on the research you read, 5 seconds in some cases. It depends on how much PC or phosphocreatine is actually, or creatine phosphate is in the muscle as a reserve already in there. That's what's going to determine, one of the determinants of how fast that ATP is produced and you run out of the substrate. So you take creatine monohydrate, right? And you can get more creatine in your muscle cells. Well, that might extend the ability of your muscle to perform very high intensity, high power output movements for a couple of seconds. Does it make that much of a difference? I don't know. Again, maybe for an athlete. Point is that the ATP PC system will give you roughly 5, 10, 12 seconds of very fast production of ATP, but it's not a lot. And because it's not a lot of ATP, the muscle simply cannot actually perform those high intensity activities for very long. And hence the reason why we talk about fatigue after 5, 10, 12 seconds. Now, that's the first one. Anaerobic, there's no oxygen involved with it. What happens after 10 to 12 to 15 seconds, whatever that number is, and you're still doing the activity? Well, intensity or power output goes down somewhat, and then your body shifts into what's known as glycolysis or anaerobic. Now, you got to make a distinction. Got to make a distinction between anaerobic glycolysis and the shift over into the aerobic system, which is known as aerobic glycolysis. So write that down. ATP PC system, 10 seconds. Just write 10. The easiest number to remember. 10 seconds of ATP production before that system essentially shuts down, the muscles fatigue out because we're not getting enough regeneration of the PC to the ATP regeneration. Don't need to get too deep into that. ATP PC, 10 seconds. Now at the bottom, what is your body able to do? Well, it can't continue to produce at that high power output. Now you're going to get sort of a degradation in power output, and it will shift into another oxygen free anaerobic pathway known as glycolysis, or anaerobic glycolysis in this case. Anaerobic glycolysis will, for the most part, provide another, again, depends on the person, could be 60 seconds, could be 75 seconds, could be 2 minutes, right? Depends on the individual, depends on how much substrate is actually in the muscle, depends on how much lactate production occurs during that time. So you got ATP PC, anaerobic glycolysis, and then now that you got that and you write that down, now you have this potential crossover. If oxygen is present, like inside the muscle cell, right, inside the liquid component, the cytoplasmic component of the muscle cell, if there's oxygen present, like by the mitochondria or right outside the mitochondria, you now have this really interesting shift over to where you can produce ATP through the pass, right? Through aerobic pathways. Because when oxygen is present, there's going to be a slowdown in the actual chemical processes to produce ATP. Way more complicated, way more steps in the processes that take, for instance, glucose or free fatty acids or even amine groups, right? Amino acids, to convert them. Lots of steps to go from substrate to ATP. Remember, in the ATP PC system, the anaerobic systems, that's like a single chemical step. That's like one step. ATPase, kinase. You've got basically one enzyme that does one thing, and then you get this. It's a very simple process, so it gets you the ATP fast, but you don't get a lot of it. Reverse that. Now in these aerobic pathways, you get a lot of ATP, more bang for your buck. It just takes longer because there's many more steps in these enzymatic reactions and processes to get to the end zone, get the ATP. The first one is this transitional pathway known as aerobic glycolysis. Again, I don't want to get too in depth into the chemical processes, but during anaerobic glycolysis, you have these end products. You have ATP produced, right? But you have this end product known as pyruvate or pyruvic acid. Okay, pyruvic acid is pretty much the end point. That's the end of the line. Now, you will get some lactate production as well, and that's going to acidify the muscle. It's going to get pushed out, go through the liver, get reconverted back into glucose. But that's sort of the end stage. But if there is oxygen present, pyruvate or pyruvic acid is not the end stage. We actually have an interesting switchover, side trail, to where you no longer have pyruvate as the end product. You have what's known as acetyl coenzyme A. Pyruvate, ain't nothing wrong with pyruvate, right? Ain't nothing wrong with acetyl coenzyme A. The only difference is that remember, you hit the wall with pyruvate, but if you have the conversion, the end product is now acetyl coenzyme A, okay, now you've just opened the door to the aerobic system. That's what we call aerobic glycolysis. Anaerobic glycolysis, boom, done. Lactate production, which is the byproduct of this anaerobic glycolytic processes, or again, oxygen present, boom, instead of pyruvate as your end product, boom, you get acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl coenzyme A is a pretty cool molecule because it now is going to open up the door into what we call if you've ever heard this, you may have heard it as a different name. When I learned, it was called the Krebs cycle. Dr. Krebs, right? The guy that figured it out, I think in the 1940s or 50s. Forgot. But it was always called the Krebs cycle. We now use other terms, the carboxylic acid cycle, is one of them. I forgot the other one, but whatever the case is, I will always use the term Krebs cycle, like the way it sounds. But the Krebs cycle now is able to take the acetyl coenzyme A and essentially take that sponge of water and squeeze out even more water from it, i.e., get more ATP from it. See, the Krebs cycle is an intermediary cycle that allows for the production of new high energy or functioning molecules to go through. Okay, so you get the idea. I said ATP PC, anaerobic glycolysis, or aerobic glycolysis. Now you move into the Krebs cycle. It's like you open the doors, and in order to go to where the money's at, right, to where the end zone is, you got to go through this. You got to go through this other foyer. I'm going to call that foyer the Krebs cycle. And the Krebs cycle is a it's a dynamic system of metabolic activity and enzymatic activity that converts the acetyl coenzyme A into a couple of different molecules, NADH, FADH2. So you get these other molecules that now are going to go into the, and I'm just highlighting this, ATP PC, anaerobic glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, Krebs cycle. Now move over into what's known as the electron transport chain, the ETC. Okay. The electron transport chain is notable because it is where the vast majority of all ATP production occurs. Okay. That occurs inside, remember the mitochondria? Remember when you were in high school and you learned that the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell? Well, in a sense, they are, because that's where that's where the vast majority, 85, 90, 95% of all the ATP produced by resting or static muscle activity occurs. Okay. And the mitochondria are there specifically to take substrates and ultimately convert them through these metabolic pathways, enzymatic pathways, all the way down what we call the electron transport chain to produce ATP. Okay. So hope that didn't confuse you. ATP PC, anaerobic glycolysis. Let me say it again, 10 seconds, let's say 10 seconds, up to 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. Anaerobic. Anything more than that is going to be functionally fed by the aerobic systems. Krebs cycle is just an intermediary cycle to take one molecule, acetyl coenzyme A, and ultimately get it to produce two other main energy molecules. By the way, we have this thing called beta oxidation, which kind of bypasses those other systems and pushes right to the Krebs cycle and feeds the electron transport chain. By the way, as long as there's oxygen, for the most part, the ETC works forever, continuously. It never ends. As long as there's a way to get rid of the carbon dioxide, right, and continue to pump oxygen into those systems, it just goes on. It's like the Energizer Bunny. It just keeps going on and on and on. It's working right now. You're sitting here watching this video. 95, 90, 95% of all the activity in your muscles, since you're sitting watching me, obviously, ATP is being produced by the electron transport chain. That's just the way it is. It's a little bit more complicated than that, but the whole point of this video is to help you to understand those pathways and what they do. Remember, ultimately, ATP is the ultimate goal. You got the two main ways to do it: anaerobically, aerobically. Just remember the names: the ATP-PC or phosphagen system, anaerobic glycolysis, aerobic glycolysis, Krebs cycle, and then the ETC or electron transport chain. Hope that was helpful. If you have any questions, you can let us know. Type understand in the comment box if this was helpful to you. If you've got any other ideas or you want to add to what I went over, please do so in the comment section. Remember, if you want to become a certified and qualified, right? See, that's the key here. Certified, great. Qualified personal trainer, then you got to go through our course. And you can get to it by clicking on that link in the description box below. Give us a like, okay? It's always good for the channel when we get likes, as well as subscribing, of course, if you have not. By the way, you can shoot over to the Facebook page as well. Just let us know if we can be of any assistance. Have a great week. See you next week.